Good morning. Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We are on page, we're at the bottom. We're on page 1343, rather. Sorry, middle of 1343. Okay. So we are coming now to the pretty much a conclusion of literally hundreds and hundreds of pages of the Rebbe Rashab's explanation, which you can sum up, if you wish, in one short line, would be the transformation of the Tzimtzum, or actually the transformation of this material world, which was created, predicated on the Tzimtzum, to the point of Ein Oid, where not just you're revealing the divine within existence, you're not just revealing light within the container, sweetness within the bitterness, light and revelation within darkness, but you're actually transforming the darkness itself. But both are necessary. You can't have one without the other. You can't just skip and say, I'll transform darkness. Because the point is that we experience it consciously, and that's an experience of light. It's essentially like someone saying, God created me, I don't have to do any Torah mitzvahs, I don't have to do anything. I'm a creation of God, so I'm connected to the Helam Ha'atzmi of the core concealment that created everything. Obviously, if you think about it, it doesn't make any sense. Then there's no Aveda, then the whole point is an experience of it, conscious experience, and going step by step as we've been learning. There's no way that you can climb without going like climbing a ladder. You begin as a yesh, a self-oriented, self-interest driven person, and slowly you experience higher levels of transcendence till you come to accept and absorb higher states of consciousness all the way up to the divine. And then when you do, and the keli has become a complete keli that can absorb light, then we're told, you know what? This keli now has something that the light itself doesn't have, and that's rooted in the very power to create a keli, which is the Rishimu, which is rooted in the Helam Ha'atzmi, or in the words we use, Gvoras Da'atik, Butzina Dekardanisa, Nikras Hatzur. These are all words that all describe more or less the same levels. Obviously, different nuances and different details, but the general gist of it. So the Rebbe Rashab is really coming now and concluding all of that. So it's really, if you go back to the last 500-600 pages, it's fascinating to see. Those of us that learned it all, those of us that joined later, you can always look back. But when I think about it, it comes together. It's like you really see the conclusion of a tremendous, what can I say, glorious symphony, lack of a better word, of how all this joins together. So in that context, the last things we've been learning is about the levels of sweetening of the bitterness, of the bitter waters. The first level, which is more or less neutralizes or overpowers or overwhelms the essentially more sweet than bitter. So the bitter doesn't taste as bitter, it tastes sweet, even though it's really not been transformed. The second level, it transforms it, but it's through a higher power, Eitz HaChaim, the opinion that that branch was the Eitz HaChaim, and that sweetens it. So like essentially transforms it, but the Oir is the dominant force, and that's more symbolic of the Aved of Tzadikim. That's the Aved of Tzadikim, because their sheer the intensity, their sheer firepower of their divine soul and Oir zaps and transforms the darkness of the animal soul. Or in the word that we learn, Shema, the Ikar is, like he says, Ikar is Amshachas E'er of Shema, Mamayla Lamata. And that transforms the darkness and the Yesh. And then there's the third level, which he considers Tshuva Amitis, real Tshuva from the bottom up. That within the darkness itself, it didn't come from light, it came from despair, comes from despair, from a state of concealment, a state of darkness, being lost. But that has that power, a certain intensity that can only come from the bottom. And that's ultimately the tshuva power. That's nimtokim b'sharshan, that the gvuras are sweetened in their root, in their source, from the Hela Ma'atzmi, from where they originated. And that's the bir of Shem Ban, Malmata Lamayla Ur Chayzer, in contrast to the Ur Yosher, the direct light of the Tzaddik. And then the next section, which we began to learn on Friday, is on bottom of page 1342, on top of 1343, is, we're in the middle of 1343. So now let's go back to what the Zohar said about Mashiach and the Tzaddikim doing tshuva. What does that mean? And how is that different than the tshuva of the Baal Tshuva? Now, we already established that a tshuva of a tzaddik could be, had nothing to do with sin. Ruach toshav elokim asher nasana. Which means he's always wanting and thirsting to connect the deeper levels of the divine. He doesn't need a sin to catapult him to want to connect to godliness. The tzaddik does it simply because his neshama constantly wants a deeper connection. Like when you love someone, you don't need to have a setback or a betrayal or a transgression in order to want to connect more. As he explained back on page, when he started the topic on page 1306, just to go back there. 1306. And yet we still say that Mashiach also the. So what do you need Mashiach for? What is Mashiach adding to it? If a tzaddik can do that on his own, he can do that on his own. Additionally, from Perek Tes and Tanya, it's clear that he also transforms the darkness. So the next section that we learn is coming to explain not just what tshuva means by a tzaddik, because that you could explain, as I just said, tshuva means that he's going deeper and deeper in his connection. Ruach toshav elokim, like he said on page 1306. His words were she'en alachet ruach toshav elokim. The ave b'tainugim, as he put it. And from the fact that Mashiach is going to do it, how does it apply to tzaddikim? Tzaddikim, it appears that they should also have the mila of the Baal Tshuva, which means the mila that comes, the greater intensity. What we just said is the tshuva of tzaddikim is there, but it doesn't have the intensity of a Baal Tshuva because it's not coming through an obstacle. It's not coming through darkness. It's not coming through a descent. And from the Lashon, it says, it's mashma that they will also have that quality. So what we did so what we're learning now is he's telling us that tzaddikim also have, not quite like a Baal Tshuva, because a Baal Tshuva, it comes completely from darkness, but relative to the tzaddik, there's any blemish is even deeper than the blemish of an actual rasha, of someone who actually did something bad. Because he's such on a high level, even the smallest subtle things also have deep impact. So in addition to the fact that a tzaddik has tshuva due to the fact that he's constantly wanting to reach higher, the fact that a tzaddik comes down to this world, so we know, like he says in Tanya, chapter 37, that even the greatest tzaddik on this world, his ava v'yira is never like it is in Gan Eden. Because the fact is he still has a body and he still contends with the world. It's true, he does never sin, but he still has to deal with the fact that there is a reality in this world that has some form of concealment. Sometimes the language is chet malosh and chesed. In Lech Lecha, Lekut Sichos, volume 5, Lech Lecha, the Rebbe speaks about how could you say a sin by the Ovis, hein hein amarkava. The Ovis were completely dedicated 24/7 chariots to God. And yet we still say the word chet. So he says chet also means chesed. Chesed and chet doesn't always mean sin. It can mean, compared to your level, you could have reached 50 gates of knowledge, and you only reached 49. That's already considered. Now, most people don't even reach the first level, the second level, but compared to someone who can reach the 50th, 49 is called chayla. Gematria chayla is 49. How could you call him a sick person? We know there are people who are sick, spiritually sick, and lacking real sickness. So Chassidus explains, because compared to his level, it's a sickness, because he's lacking something. You know, when you say, for example, the Rebbe says in Tafshin 30 years ago, 31 years ago, the Rebbe said, I did everything I can to bring Mashiach. And they said, everything I did was for naught. Lehevel larik. How could you say that? The Rebbe did everything he did was for naught. But compared to bringing Mashiach, the Rebbe considered everything he did. We didn't cross the finish line. The Medrash says, I quote this often in that context, it says on Hevel Havolim in Kehelas, that Kol Teira Be'elam Hazeh Hevel Hu L'Gabe Teirasa Shel Mashiach. All the Teira in this world, Be'elam Hazeh, is Hevel, naught. Hevel means worthless. Hevel means like empty, vain, naught compared to the Teira of Mashiach. You know what that means? That means Matan Teira, Haneich Hashem L'Kecha, God coming down on Mount Sinai, giving the Teira to Moshe. Everything Moshe Rabbeinu learned and taught. Everything Yeshua learned. Everything in Tanakh, Teira, Nevi'im, Ksuvim, Teira Shebiksav, Teira Shebal Peh, the Mishnah, the Gemara, everything, all the generations of Teira till Mashiach comes is called Hevel compared to Teira of Mashiach. How could you say such a thing? I mean, it's like if someone said that and it wasn't a medrash, you'd say that's the most sacrilegious thing you can say. You could say it's not the highest level, but when you know what level Mashiach is, if you understood it, it would be like that. It would be like naught. That's how high. In other words, it's not about the Torah today. It's talking about what the ultimate purpose is. The higher you know what godliness is, the more you realize that even the smallest blemish is a big thing. If you're not so high in the mountain, so the horizon is not so big, so you already achieved something. But the higher you go, in a sense, the lower you are, basically. Not lower in a bad way. Lower in a way you understand the Ein Sof of it. So every little detail, every blemish, like I explained in the last class, even a drop of dust on the eyeball is irritating. A dust on your finger is meaningless, is insignificant. So in that sense, even a tzaddik, therefore, also has a certain anguish, like a Baal Tshuva. He didn't call it anguish yet, but you'll soon see that basically it's not just that he's looking for Ein Sof and his tshuva is to go higher and higher. He actually, his thing is, like he said, I'll use the exact language we learned, that he said like this, that the tzaddikim would be considered like chaytim, like sinners, and even more than actual someone who sinned. How could you say such a thing? How can you say the Rebbe, a tzaddik, who never sinned once in his life, in some ways worse than a sinner? Because we're not talking about comparing the sin. You're compare the level that he's at. So based on that, that's considered something that's lacking. So when you're at such high level, even one drop is lacking is a tremendous lack, even more than what a sinner is experiencing. Even though in the pure form of reward and punishment, and of course, the spiritual status, you can't compare the two. One is a tzaddik, one is a rasha. But in this aspect, it has that element. So going back to just summing up what we learned, that tshuva, like he said, Mehusa tshuva ba b'chol dover lefi madrigosim mekayim. Now you understand how important that line was. Tshuva is not something that is a set in stone, black and white statement, doing tshuva. It's always relative to the person's level and location, meaning stature. That's what tshuva is. Tshuva is not just go do tshuva. It depends who you are. Every tshuva for every person is relative. Based on a tzaddik's high level, his tshuva is to correct the thing that is lacking compared to what he could have been or what he's able to be. To repair the blemish that is according to his level. And he explained that that there's nefesh, ruach, neshama, and there's a difference. The nefesh is behavioral blemishes or mistakes or transgressions. Ruach is emotional ones, and neshama is intellectual ones. So the most tangible is, of course, a behavior. If you do something, you damage something, you hurt someone physically, is obviously in a certain way the worst possible hurt. But on a subtle level, a person whose mind is polluted and contaminated, a person whose mind is corrupted, in many ways is far deeper problem. Because if he behaved the wrong way, fine, his behavior, maybe you can educate him differently. But if a person's mind has become corrupted, then you're dealing with a much harder thing to correct. because their whole mindset is wrong. And the lower level would be emotions. So he said everything is, so emotions is more daka pnimi than action. Moichin is more daka pnimi than emotions. That's one thing. And the second thing he brought was the difference in neshamas. That neshamas, they're neshamas of greish and regel. So depending on the level of the neshama, that's the level of the tshuva. And from that, he went back to tshuva v'tzadikim, that it's lefi erkam dafke. Not mitzad etzem abgam. I'm reading from inside, he says. Not because they have the fundamental blemish or flaw. But compared to their level, that which is lacking is considered in a certain way of a deeper lack than someone who's on a lot lower level, even though they may have done an actual sin or have an actual blemish. That the Eibush is medagdik, literally like the hair, literally like a hair. I mentioned 3 hairs on the head isn't much, but 3 hairs in the soup is right. So the same idea here. That's where we stopped. So basically, based on that relativity theory or relative element, there's a certain way, like he says, worse. He's considered worse than a chait who actually sinned within a far greater sin, a Vedic Gdela, in a big sin, in that sense. So you see here the standard the Rebbe Rashab is applying to himself, of course, and to tzaddikim of this level, how by them, one going off one drop is in many ways worse than someone who's done a serious transgression. But again, it's not a contradiction based on what we just described and explained. But he's going to explain this further with an example, and so there's more explanation for this. But the point is to explain how the tshuva of a tzaddik, and he's going to come back to why Mashiach dafka, because it's only Mashiach when that revelation will be of such high level that the tzaddik will feel this lack. Today, the tshuva is more just going from level to level, but to feel a lack. So what you're seeing here, and this is very vital, I want to say before I continue reading, you're seeing that even though it's shema, and it's mamayl lamato, from the top down, and it's oir, transforming darkness, but you see now even choshech, keli, and ban, and even an element of the reshimu and the helam is also by the tzaddik, lefi erech. So basically you could say it's like the keli within the oir. We're soon going to learn that there's also the other way around, that a Baal Tshuva, who's primarily Keli and darkness, also has within him a Shema that brings to Tshuva. So there is ultimately going to be clarified here that there's a skalalus, there's interconnectivity. It's not just either light transforming darkness or darkness hitting rock bottom and recognizing and out of despair coming to Helam Atzmi. But there's actually a piece of each and each one. The Ur has Keli in it, and the Keli has Ur in it. The Helam has Ur, and the Ur has Helam, which ultimately is going to come back to both that the Rishima has both the Helam Atzmi and also Ur concealed within it. And the same thing with Ur. Ur has Gili, but has also Etzema Ur that's higher than Gili. And ultimately, as I said many times, I say it again, you're talking about a total fusion of the Helam and the Gili. Not just 2 different tracks that the Baal Tshuva is here, the Tzaddik is here, and that's that. You want to have the Tzaddik to have the quality of the Tshuva, and you want the Baal Tshuva to have the quality of the Tzaddik. And that's ultimately where he's going with all of this as he ties together the knots here of this whole, as I said, last 500 pages for sure, regarding the transformation of the Tzimtzum to Ur. And that only makes it even richer, how Ur and Cheshach work together. Remember, v'yedaita hayoim, yom and laila, day and night, that they both complement each other and they both add to each other. And ultimately, even when you come to the 3rd level of sweetening of einoid, you still want to have Ur involved and the other way around as well. So you need both, basically, Uris and Kalim, and then the Kalim revealing a deeper dimension. And we're going to learn even Tzaddikim also get this deeper dimension as well, to some extent. So, with that, I'm ready to continue unless somebody wants to ask something. The Yuvan Zeh, so I'm in the middle of page 1343, almost a half a page down. The line begins Yechshav Lechet, and we'll start from V'Yuvan Zeh. We'll understand this distinction between tzaddikim and an actual sinner, transgressor, with this example. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. So he says, V'Yuvan Zeh al derech moshel hayadua. Just 1 second, guys. 1 second, please. Okay, the Yuvan Zeh derech moshel hayadua. We'll understand this with an example. For example, a known example, behefer shebein adam lebehema, in the distinction, the difference between a human and animal. Interesting. Before we used behema and chaya, cattle and animal. So now human and animal. Adam hu bal seichel. A human being is a creature of intellect. And he's qualitatively separate and different from an animal. It's not a quantitative difference. It's not like a smarter animal, a less smarter. It's a different category. He's a Baal Seichel. As a result of this qualitative difference, there's also a very different approach of how we look at how their behavior affects things. And he gives now the example like this. Valkain, and therefore, due to this distinction, when a behema expels its waste, in some way defiles or dirties in the Heichel HaMelech, in the king's chamber. And we need to clean out the Heichel. So in some way, an animal is not besmirched. What's the word? He's besmudged. He's not smart. He's dirtied that Heichel, and you need to clean it out. Ein ze pele klal. It's not such a wonder. I mean, what an animal is doing inside the king's palace is another story. But there are dogs, cats. This can be any type of behemoth. But regardless, it's not such a wonder because that's what behemoths do. They're not always in control of themselves. So derech behemoth kach. That's the way a behemoth behaves. A behemoth does not have that type of control, and at times they will dirty, and they will mitanefes ha'hechel. Aval adam, but since a person is a very different category, has self-control and is an intelligent person, shemetanef hechel hamelech yechuav misa. If a person did it, dirties the king's chamber. So al pi halacha yechuav misa. He gets the capital punishment. He's responsible with death. Ki yivayir ke'esh chames hamelech al ish she'es adovim mechur kazeh. Because the anger, the fiery, the anger that flares up in the anger of the king on this person that behaved in such a despicable way, and he'll command that this person be expelled, be thrown out, and be extremely punished and severely punished. What's the difference? The dirt is the same. What's the difference between the dirt or the waste of an animal, the waste of a human being? But the person is different. Because the animal, you have to clean it up, and it's not respectful, it's true, but you don't blame the animal. Human being, it's a whole different story. Interesting example. It's probably the Alter Rebbe's example, if I were to guess. I don't remember where, but that's what he says here. So that's the example. Now he's going to give an example in human beings themselves. Similarly, there's a difference, the difference between avodim, servants, and ministers in the king's palace. If the servant sins or transgresses or in some way defies the king, an eved, meaning a lower level servant, compared, his punishment will be a small one. But a great minister, even if he transgresses, he just goes off something that's just not even a real sin. It's very subtle. One subtle thing he didn't do as the king wanted him to do, it'll be considered for him as a great sin, to the point that he will be punished with a severe punishment. For the same reason, because you're talking about the stature of the person, who the person is. Because it's all relative to his quality, to his stature, I should say. That's how the intensity of the punishment is. So it's not the actual crime that's looked at, or the actual transgression, or the actual mistake that was made, or blemish, but the person who's doing it. Afila bechet kal b'yesir. The greater the punishment, even if the chet is a much more lenient one, much more lenient transgression. Okay, now he's going to bring it back to the nimshal. What's the moral in our discussion about neshamis? V'kachu l'maylo, same thing that is above, be'inyan ha'efesh ben chet pachas ha'erech lechet ha'neshamis ha'gavoyis. The difference between a sin from someone who's on a lower stature, pachas ha'erech, to the sin of great souls, of exalted souls. Ukidua, as it's known, and he's going to now show us a comparison, Adam and Behema, she has beis madreges b'neshamas. In souls, we know it says in Zohar and in other places, there are two types of souls: b'chinas Adam or b'chinas Behema. Souls that are compared to a human souls, and souls that are compared to like animal souls. He doesn't mean here nefesh habam is the animal soul. He means in the stature, like the shamas of Atzilus is going to say, Ukumesha Kosav v'zerati es b'nei Yisrael, zera Adam v'zera Behema. I've sowed the children of Israel, the zera Adam, the seed of man and the seed of animal. So Chassidus, Kabbalah, Chassidus explained that there's two types of neshamas. Like we talk about neshamas, the ma, neshama is the ban. Ma is Adam, ban is gematria Behema. So just to make it clear, it's not a demeaning statement, Behema. It means relative to like a Behema and Adam on earth. The same is that neshamas that are more involved in material existence, and neshamas that are more spiritual by nature. So the question is, Zarua Latzadik, that the divine energy is Zarua Latzadik, is sowed and implanted, embedded in Tzadik. So it says the Zarua Latzadik Neshamas Geveyes, that's the Zera, meaning the seed, like a seed of divine energy. There are exalted souls, higher level souls, Shenikroim Zera Adam, Begadlus Hadas Shebetzelem Adam Elyon. They're called Zera Adam because they're das. They're the way they are shaped, the way they were formed, is with a superior, a higher level divine consciousness in the tselem of Adam Elyon, in the image of the supernal man in which they were created. So all human beings are created in the divine image, but some have a higher level of godless hadas. That's Zera Adam. The Yesh B'chin is Zera Behema, and the second is like the seed Zera Behema, Shalamatim in Hadas, the B'chin is Katnus B'Yesef. So just like an animal has less das, or is beneath the das of an Adam, on a lower level of das, or Katnus B'Yesef, like we said, Katnus means more diminished, less mature, less developed, less superior. And that would be an example, Ka'ama Oretz, Ukahai Gavna, like Amma Oretz. So Amma Oretz is an expression, we don't really use it today in anybody, because Amma Oretz in the time of Shas, the concept of Amma Oretz was someone who's a Talmid Chacham, a person, a scholar who is of a higher spiritual state. Amma Oretz literally means nations of the earth. They're more earthy people, basically. Today we use the word Amma Oretz as an ignoramus. Amma Oretz, he doesn't know anything, which technically, generally is correct, but the real meaning of it is a lower stature person, because we can't talk about a tinuk shenishba and Am Haaretz, because Am Haaretz means that he doesn't have the capacity. It's not that he didn't have the opportunity. When you say somebody who didn't have the opportunity, never went to yeshiva, or never learned, you really would not apply the word Am Haaretz to a person like that, because they just never had the opportunity. Am Haaretz of Shas really means someone who is actually a person of a lower level stature in spiritual consciousness. So he says, Am Haaretz ukai gavna. It's on a neshama level. Remember, talking to Zera Behema, not on opportunity level, on a neshama level. Today you could have a tinuk shenishbu who never learned Torah, but a neshama level could be higher than someone who's learned a lot of Torah. So it's a different categorization. I just want to clarify that. It says, okay, so there's the two levels now, Zera Adam, Zera Behema. So the idea that Moshe gave before, that each one is going to be treated differently because based on their stature. So the same thing in the Nimshal. When you talk about Neshamas, like the Sar and the Eved, the minister and the servant. And commensurate to each one on their level, that will be the level of their punishment or the consequences, the effect of their behavior. I generally don't like to use the word punishment, even Einish is punishment, because it's not really about punitiveness. It's more about the effect that a person on a higher level, when he misses something, is much bigger than the effect of someone who may be on a smaller level and may have done something worse technically. The vada in neshama shenikroim zera adam or nikrois, and because certainly neshamas that are called zera adam, the seed of man, kishiyimse behem eze begam, and when you find within them some blemish, dak shebedakus, that is subtle within subtlety, the subtlety within subtlety, chet godel yachshav meched am haaretz b'peil mamish. It's considered a greater sinner. He'll be considered greater sinner than the chet of an Am Haaretz who doesn't know anything and who actually sinned in actuality. So even though by him it's much more subtle, and if you compare the two actual behaviors, one is far worse than the other, but the person's stature is so much higher, so he's going to be considered a greater chet, a god. Okay, let me stop if anybody wants any explanation. I think it's pretty clear. But please, I think I mentioned the other day about Moshe Rabbeinu hitting the rock. Same idea why he was punished for that when hitting the rock doesn't seem. I don't know if I mentioned, and I mentioned Rab Chia with buying meat on credit because of his level, but I don't know if I mentioned this. I remember in a Farbrengen, the Rebbe once cited this. He's talking about the Frierdiker Rebbe. When the Frierdiker Rebbe was in prison, Yud Beis Tammuz, released from prison, Yud Beis Tammuz, so they wanted the Soviets, the Bolsheviks wanted to humiliate him and wanted to demonstrate how they controlled him. So they said that they want him to leave by train certain day, and he asked, when will the train arrive back in Petersburg, in Leningrad, where he lived? So they said on Sunday. It would leave Thursday and arrive on Sunday. And he would refuse to go. What they wanted to show was that he was riding on a train on Shabbos. Now, halachically, first of all, pekuach nefesh, he could have been killed any moment. So pekuach nefesh decha kol ha'teira kula, even riding on a train on Shabbos, frankly. But especially on Thursday, if you set out on a train Thursday and you don't go off the train, you're allowed to ride through Shabbos. So the Rebbe asked, why did he refuse? Because besides their intentions, because he knew what the whole point was. He's the Rebbe. He wasn't just another citizen. And even though you can find a heter and loopholes, or more than loopholes, even lechatchila, but he knew the impression, Maris Ayin, for a person like the Rebbe, who everybody knew who he was. And he was publicly arrested for his Mesiras Nefesh for Yiddishkeit. For that to be said, that they could use that to say, you see, your Rebbe wrote on Shabbos, to show that already for him was too much. And that was, so the Rebbe said, it's all the fiyerach, the person. Another person who was not on that level, it wouldn't make such a chil, it wouldn't make a chil Hashem altogether. But chil Hashem and kiddush Hashem is not objective based on the action, it's based on who's doing it. If you see a great scholar, a great Talmid Chacham who's a role model, behave in a way, even if it's a subtle thing, it can be a far worse transgression in concept than someone else who nobody knows or nobody necessarily respects doing something far worse. That's just another example of the ramifications of this concept that he's describing here. So even though I wouldn't call it a ched dakas, but the point is the similar one, that it's about the impact, about the relative to that level. Like I said, the dust on the eyeball is far more irritating, or the dust of the blemish inside of the Holy of Holies, because you're dealing with a very holy place. I'll just say as an aside, by the way, this may be helpful. It's not really the topic, but it can help understand it. Whenever I explain sometimes the concept of sexuality, and in contrast to intimacy, Torah calls it intimacy, das, to know, Adam Yodas Chava, it's an intimate connection. So you see the halachas around sexuality, in Taras Mishpacha and Torah is very, very detailed. You know, the details of mikveh, of hefsek tara, of nida. You know, everything is so detailed. I mean, you look at it, it looks somewhat obsessive. You know, if you don't know better, it seems like a crazy obsession. It's almost like the laws of Pesach, maybe even more obsessive. So I remember I was once asked by a journalist, they were writing something about it, and the article they wrote was going to be a very negative one about these religious men and women that they look at, you know, checking the blood and checking exactly what is it, not matters. And she was going to, I mean, it was ripped apart. She showed me the article. And I really felt like it was a real chil or kiddush Hashem could happen here. So I said to her, this is years ago, I said, do you mind having a conversation about this? She respected me because she came to some of my classes. But she was essentially grew up in a very anti-religious environment. And, you know, when you read on the surface level, it looks really strange to someone on the outside. So I sat with her and I told her the following. I said to her something similar to this idea. I said, you have to understand, sexuality is the seat of life. Any child born on this earth came because a husband and wife were together intimately. That's the only way a child is born. And therefore, when you're talking about the very matter that creates life, it's not, nothing is too small, because you're dealing with the most subtle, the most powerful thing called creation. If you take a seed in the ground and you make a little scratch on it, what's the big thing? You make a scratch on a table, you could always fix it, or you can repair it cosmetically, whatever. Because the seed is so subtle and so concentrated, on that level, every little thing matters. A newborn baby, you don't just throw around. You don't just pull them because they're so gentle. It's like in the most gentlest place, that's where you have the most irritants and the most damage can be done. So the Torah's laws around sexuality are, because we're going into the Holy of Holies, you're going to the holiest place on earth, which is the ability to give birth. God has given the human being the power to give birth to another creature. I mean, it's a miracle of miracles. We don't give birth to anything. Everything we do is reshape. We don't create anything really. So the laws are extremely careful because every detail matters. The effect it had on her, I must tell you, was unbelievable. She chose not to write the article. Not only that, later, over the years, she became a real advocate for Taras Mishpacha. She married later and so on with children. But the point was that when she heard it that way, she never heard of it, didn't think of the concept even. It gave a whole different take on it. And it's a very similar idea that wherever there's tremendous amount of kedusha and holiness, every little blemish makes far more big difference. That's why also dam hu nefesh. You're not supposed to eat blood. So the question is, what do you mean? All food turns into blood. So why not just eat blood in the first place? Blood is the liquid of life, because blood is so kaddish. It's a nefesh, dam hu nefesh, that eating blood is such a holy thing. You just stay away. You don't touch it in the sense of consuming it, because it has so much gedusha. That's where the most tuma gathers. Where do bacteria gather? Not where there's dry and arid location. They go where there's nourishment. The more nourishment, the more the bacteria will gather. And that's why every little subtle thing matters when you're dealing with more powerful. Like, for example, the same bacteria that we can repel on a regular day, if you're inside, God forbid, in surgery, and the internal organs are open, that place is sterilized big time. Why? It's the same bacteria. Because it's not the bacteria, it's the location you're at. When certain things are exposed and they're more sensitive, more vulnerable, or higher level, like we're learning here, every little subtle thing matters. I'm just giving some more examples that this concept is a very powerful one in so many areas of life. Okay. Okay,
the surgery one is a phenomenal example. That's a phenomenal example. Really brings it home.
Yeah, thank you.
Very powerful.
Rabbi Jacobson, these different levels, we're talking about Zera Behema, Zera Adam. I assume we're talking about the Nefesh al Bahamas.
No.
Nefesh al Kis? Which one are we talking about here? I mean,
I explained, I said earlier that it's nothing to do with Nefesh Habamis, Nefesh Alikis. It's simply two levels of neshama. Kabbalah and Chassidus talk about two levels. It's like saying neshamas of Atzilus and neshamas of Bria or Biyah.
Yeah, but
it's called neshamas of Ma and neshamas of Ban. It has nothing to do with animal soul at all.
But we know through Chassidus that a neshama is made up of a nefesh Bahamas and nefesh Alakis. So
yeah, but that's not Zera Adam, Zera Behema. That's something else.
So what's it? So what aspect of the neshama, if it's not relating to either one of those two, when we call it neshama, nefesh Bahama,
what you're doing here is the classic thing. You're bringing other subjects, and it's confusing. Imagine you never knew about nefesh Alakis, nefesh Habamis. You wouldn't ask this question, right? Why don't you understand? There's two levels of neshamas of Atzilus, as neshamas of Bria, neshamas of Yetzirah, neshamas of Asiya, right?
Yes.
Yetzirah and Asiya. We don't use the words nefesh Alakis, nefesh Habamis there. There are different levels of souls. Just like there's souls of Chesed, there's souls of Gvura. There's souls like Moshe Rabbeinu is a neshama of Ma. Eliyahu is a neshama of Ban. So one would be called Zera Adam, one would be called Zera Behema. Then there's another thing. There's that within each person, there's two nefashis, nefesh Alakis and nefesh Habamis. So yes, you could say in a Zera Adam, nefesh Alakis will probably be more dominant and maybe the only power, or he could transform. Whereas a Zera Behema, maybe the nefesh Habamis may be strong, but not necessarily. Eliyahu Navi was a tzaddik, but he was a neshama of Ban, of Zera Behema. So we're not talking here about the animal soul as in what he says in Tanya, that resides in the left side of the heart and it's driven by impulse. We're talking about a level of a neshama that's just not the level of Adam. It's a lower level of Das. It's like we say the generation of Moshe Rabbeinu was Der Deya. Later generations is neshamas of Chagas. And we are neshamas of Ekev, Ikvasa de Meshicha, like he says in Tanya, chapter 2, the Regel. We said before, neshamas Regel, neshamas Roish. That's nothing, that has nothing to do with Nefesh Alakis, Nefesh Habamis. You see the difference?
Yeah, I do see what you're saying, but I'm just trying to relate it to our understanding since we're going to diuk of
Maybe you can't
oral
relate it. Maybe
sensation.
it's not connected. As I said, there's neshamas in different generations. They come from different levels and sources. Then there's another story when they come down below that you have two nefashos within each person has two souls.
So you're saying it's level of das, so different levels of das.
Or different levels of divine consciousness, whatever you want to call. I mean, you never heard of the thing that there's neshamas of Atzilus and neshamas of Biyah?
Sure, of course.
So, 1 second. Why don't you associate there Nefesh Elikis, Nefesh Abamis? We don't talk about that language there. It's different levels of neshama. Think of neshamas Atzilus like neshamas of Ma or Adam, Zera Adam, neshamas of Biyah, neshamas Zera Biyah. Not always, but just generally speaking, you can think of it that way.
So when we say in light of Ayin Beis, what we're learning here,
you're continuing to process, and I'm not going to go there, as you can understand, because he doesn't talk about the divine and animal soul here. You want to fit that into here, and it's not going to fit.
That's what I want to do.
I know, I see, but I'm not sure whether you could do it.
Okay. I'm just trying to see how they all fit together. Where the whole idea of these last 500 pages is to bring everything
not
together.
every word behemoth fits with every other time it says behemoth. It's different. It can be different things.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So now he says like this. It says this is also why we say slach lanu after Shemoneh Esrei. Why would we ask for forgiveness, say tachnun after Shemoneh Esrei? It says v'zehu she'emrim b'Shemoneh Esrei slach lanu avinu. Well, in Shemoneh Esrei, sorry, in Shemoneh Esrei. We say in Shemoneh Esrei, which is the highest level of davening, slach lanu avinu ki chatanu. Forgive us, our Father, because we sinned. Afal pisha b'Kriyas Shema, even though Kriyas that preceded Shemoneh Esrei, we said, Omer v'ahavta b'chol levavcha b'chol nafshecha. We said, loving God with all our heart and with all our soul. So seemingly, at that point, there should no longer be chet. U'b'Shemoneh Esrei bo l'chlal bitl b'mitzias b'kirvosei le'elokuz b'tachlis. Shemoneh Esrei is the level in davening where you stand up. Avdei kamamor, you stand in complete bittul. You come to bittul mitzias b'kirvosei le'elokuz. In all the levels of the climbing the ladder of davening, there's 4 rungs of davening, of prayer. So Shemoneh Esrei, which is the conclusion, the high point. You come to bittul mitzias, utter nullification, in his getting closer to God, b'tachlis, the utter closeness to God, b'ilui ha'asoga alikis, an exalted understanding, comprehension of godliness, and the level of literally visualizing godliness. And now he's standing before the king himself. So the prayers before Shemoneh Esrei, you're preparing yourself to enter the inner chamber of the king. But Shemoneh Esrei, you're on that level. So you would think, and once you said v'ahavta b'chol levavcha b'chol nafshecha, why are you saying slach lanu ki chatanu? Says the Rebbe Rashab, the Adarabba, on the contrary, because on the contrary, he hanesenes, on the he hanesenes, that alone explains it. Aches shekorav el pnei melech, being that he's now that close to the pnei melech, to the king's face, to the face of the king, nasa b'nafshe chet gadol yesef. In his spirit, this person now feels much bigger sin. Because he's on such a high level, now he feels the lack of avodah, the avodah is not complete. He feels like a greater sinner than he would have felt before, because he wasn't on such a high level. And that's why he says, Slach lanu, forgive me. Slach lanu, forgive us. Levakish al nafshe slichu mechila yesem me'evri aveda gashmis. to request on his spirit, on his soul, a forgiveness and atonement, even more than the physical sinners. Then by those that are from the level of Zera Behema, the lower level of the soul, like a Amoritz, and etc., and similar. So this explains the same idea. As the person climbs higher, they feel more inadequate in that sense. Now, the Rebbe Rashab adds in the parentheses an additional point that another mimer it says like this. So this is more relative to you. As you climb higher, you feel much more sensitive, much more sensitized, and much more sensitive to every blemish, much more. But he adds something else. It's explained, Shagam ba'aveda shalahem, nechshavim kechetim, that this level people, when they come to the Shemoneh Esrei, and also in their aveda, they're considered like sinners. Why? Not just because they feel the blemish more, but because mipnei shekol aveda ein amitis klal legabe amitasi yizbarach. Because all their aveda, no matter how great it is, once they come to this level, they realize is not true aveda compared to the truth of God. Imagine what he's saying here. In other words, as true and high their aveda is, but when they realize what God is like, it doesn't come to that truth. It reminds me of a story with Rabbi Isaac Homler. He was a great chassid of the Alter Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek. And he was so great that he could have been a Rebbe himself. He wrote many books. And he was a tremendous Gaon scholar, but his bittul was so deep that he was once sitting and speaking about how he's nothing. He was belittling himself, that he has no schusim, he said. I have no merits. And people looked at him like, how could you say that? What do you mean you have no merits? A man of such stature, everyone knew he was. And then when he sees that they were like surprised, that they were like taken aback by his humility, he says, the truth is I do have one merit. The merit I have, he said, was once the Alter Rebbe was learning in a sefer, and a page fell down on the floor, and I had the merit to pick it up and put it back on the table to the Alter Rebbe that he should have the page to learn from. So the Chassidim around him started laughing. So they were laughing because that he thinks is his merit, is a man that's a baki b'shas, a oived, a mashpia. He had so many qualities. For all things he found was he picked up a page from the Alter Rebbe. So they were laughing because they felt completely out of touch. The truth is, he didn't understand why they were laughing. That's how humble he was. So he said to them, no, it's true. I did pick up. He thought they were laughing that he ever had that schus. They thought that he made up that's not necessarily, not that he made up a story, but they were laughing. Yeah, you picked up a page for the Rebbe. Who do you think you are? And he said, no, it's true. I did pick up this page for the Rebbe. When I read this line, I remind myself of that story. Here's a man of such stature, but when apparently the level that he was exposed to and he understood what real Aveda is, Amites is Baruch. So for that, turns him into like his Aveda is worthless. Doesn't even see himself as being anything. Anyway, just to throw in that as well. V'zehu v'sviva of dafke. So he's going back to the pasuk he brought, v'sviva of nishara ma'od. That this is the ones that are surrounded, that God surrounds, that are close to God. Dafke medardik aleim kechut asayra. With them, he's precise. Kechut asayra. Chut means like a thread of a hair, basically a strand of hair. that even a strand of hair, most people, we're not medagdic on that level. You give people some latitude, you give them some breathing room. But here, with such level people, chut aside, a one drop, like the Tsar, the great minister, goes off one iota, 1 centimeter from where it should be. That's already a tremendous thing. V'zehu inyan hatshuva shebet tzadikim, and this is the tshuva of tzadikim, dafke tzadikim, mipnei hakiru va'ilui shelehem. Not coming from their darkness, it's coming because of their kiruv and their ilui, because of their closeness. The oir is so close to its source that they feel this inadequacy and the sense of, and that's what they do tshuva for. So it's not just that they see Ein Sof, like climbing a mountain, and you could always climb higher because there's more to climb. But actually, that they feel the inadequacy, they feel something that's lacking. And that lack is even deeper than the lack of someone, if you put it on a scale, would be far bigger lack, but not relative to this level of the soul. That's what he says here. Okay. Any questions?
I have a question, and I'm trying not to bring material from outside this. I'm wondering if this is a source for a mimer of the Rebbe that I read this weekend, Barashai Chot Shechem, where he talks about the inyan of iskafia being a higher reach for, in a sense, for tzaddikim, because they've already completed hisavcha, they're completely transformed no Sahara. But the thing there that they miss, so to speak, is the yearning for the Eibishter that the Baal Tshuva or the sinner has when they're trying to get tshuva, and sort of that. That's where you get the place where the Baal Tshuva goes, even though tzaddik can't rise to, because the tzaddik, even though he's being ava b'tanugim, he's just he's in a place where he can just please God to such greatness. Nevertheless, he can't experience that yearning for God because he's already there. And I'm wondering if this is connected.
I don't know.
Oh.
Maybe, maybe not. I can't tell you for sure. The Rebbe Rashab doesn't allude to it. So I would probably say that he's using this as the example and maybe doesn't want to use that for whatever reason. Or you could connect it. It's possible. I mean, he doesn't go into detail here. He doesn't go into detail of what the tshuva of the tzaddik is. But it most likely makes sense that the tshuva would be one that would include, I don't want to use the word anguish necessarily or distress, because not quite that level, but definitely the inadequacy is a powerful one. So, but he doesn't say anything more that I can't say. There's not enough data here for me to answer that. It may be a different point, or maybe one that complements what he's saying here. Possible. Not a contradiction for sure, but I don't know if that's the point here. You just want to make the connection, or does that answer a question that you may have that's not satisfied in what we learned here?
Well, it was both, but you answered both.
Yeah, so as I said, it's definitely worth thinking about. Maybe he'll say more when he gets back to the Baal Tshuva. I think it's not over yet, so it could be there'll be more information.
Okay.
And we don't have a lot more to go. Now there's going to be 2 more pages, really, 1 or 2 pages. Next paragraph is going to be about Mashiach, why Mashiach is the one that does this level of tshuva. But now, we're coming close to basically by page 1349, we're now 43, we're going to finish the big parentheses and go back from Tefillah to Torah, which is going to be an interesting twist as we get there.
You know what? I just checked the footnote.
A surprising twist. 1 second. It will be a surprising twist, but we'll save that when we get there. So right now, he's going to talk about the Tshuva Mashiach, The next paragraph on page 1344 is going to go back to the Baal Tshuva, and then it's going to go back to the transformation of darkness in the fullest sense of the word, and tie it all together. But yeah. What were you saying? Sorry.
No, it's okay. Go ahead, George.
Oh, to your point, Yitzchak, just an example, and I'm not saying that this is related, but just an example of what you just said. There is a story of the Rebbe that somebody went to, and a shluchim took a person that wanted to marry a non-Jewish girl, and took him to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe basically said, "I envy you," and the guy was shocked, and he's like, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, you have this test and you have this ta'ava, and I don't, and I wish I did." And it would be amazing if you be able to pass the test, because I could never do such a thing, and I'm not in that position. So just to your point.
I heard this story, but I didn't hear that line. The Rebbe said, "I wish I did." He just said that I envy you because you have that test. But yeah.
Interesting. This is more of a qualitative thing, though. I'm not saying your muscle's bad. I'm just saying that this point is more subtle. It has to do with the level of service too. It's not just tzaddik doesn't do tshuva mamish. I'm not sure. We're learning it here, but the mimer I talked about was more like the level of avoida, the level of service that basically tzaddik has to amp it up even more if that's possible. Like the Baal Tshuva has to amp up his or her, avoda in order to do tshuva, something like that.
Question is, should we go on or should we stop here? I think we should stop here.
I think it's a good stopping place, personally.
Okay, we'll stop here by the end of the paragraph, bottom of page 1343.